Hello, my name is Tim Wilmot and welcome to my watercolour demo of animals in the landscape and a rural scene. So in this watercolour I'll be covering a few techniques like laying down a wash, wet in wet, bit of splattering, blending colours. I've only got 3 colours in my palette which I'll show you shortly. Negative painting, as in painting around the animals and some people, plus some dry brush strokes. I'll also be going through the normal stages I go through in a painting and covering such things as timing. Now, anyone who's seen my previous demos will know that I paint in a loose style or impressionistic style, so I'll be done in about an hour or so. So this is my reference photo. This is Avebury in Wiltshire, southwest England. It's a very old Neolithic monument containing 3 stone circles around the village of Avebury in Wiltshire, and loads of large boulders which were erected 4,500 years ago, so similar age to Stonehenge. And it's a bit different from Stonehenge because you can actually walk amongst them, touch them, and there's goats freely roaming around the place as well, which will be the subject for the painting. So animals in a landscape, similar to people in an urban scene. I'm including animals to give a bit more interest. Not that the stones aren't uninteresting, but to give an idea of scale and a bit more interest to the picture. Now, some of these stones are quite massive. I think the largest ones in this picture are nearly 40 tons or so. So I want to give an impression of their size, and animals and people will help me do that. So when looking at a scene or a photograph, thinking how suitable will it be for a painting and my approach to it, I have to think, well, what's my composition going to be? Where's the focal point? What's going to be on my left-hand side, my right-hand side? If I imagine this as a photograph, cropping it to make it into a nice balanced composition, and thinking about those focal points and where is the lightest area, where is the darkest area, and trying to perhaps put the lightest area next to the darkest area. And also thinking about what to leave out, what to include that may not be there already. So I think with this one, I'm going to be concentrating on, if you imagine the left-hand third, ignore that. I'm going to move over to the right-hand 2/3 of the painting and include some people on the right-hand side. I'll leave the goats pretty much as they are and make a bit more of the shadows to the left-hand. So the sun's coming from the right-hand side, making more of the shadows on the left-hand side of the stones, and maybe some shadows dragging along the pasture land here as well. So this is actually going to be a 3-colour painting. My palette only consists of 3 colours. I'm going to be using, the red I'm using is called a rose opera. All these colours are from Sennelier, a French make. So the red is a rose opera, the yellow is a yellow light, and the blue is what they call a cinereous blue. I don't know how they came to that description from the French description. And I've also got a neutral tint, or you could use a Payne's grey to help me get those darks. All right, so starting then with my initial sketch. So the paper I'm using is Saunders Waterford. This is 300 grams in weight, watercolor paper, and it's a medium texture, not the ultra rough. This is not NOT, and it's 300 grams in weight, secured down on a piece of Corex board at a slight angle, about 10 degrees or 15 degrees, secured down with some masking tape. So, starting off with the initial drawing, I'm using a 3B pencil here, quite soft, and getting that larger stone there, so you can see that's in the left, on the left hand sort of third, if you like, left hand third, and then that next stone sideways on, and then some background trees, and that farm building on the right hand side, and then the base of that building, some indication of some shadows, and then just some curves there, just to a bit of continuation from the stones themselves. So starting with the animals then, and I think I'm going to have to pay a good bit of attention to these. I can't really do them in a brisk impressionistic style. I need to concentrate on their shape to make them realistic. And these goats, they're quite sort of skinny compared to sheep, but as I say, I need to spend a bit of time getting them absolutely right in this drawing, because it's not easy to rectify things when you start painting. So there's a couple of goats. Goat number 3 quite prominent in the front. And then just an indication of the legs, which I probably won't paint around. I'll be using some white gouache for that. And then let's get some people on the right hand side, perhaps walking towards us, and a second figure. I start off with the head and then the shoulders, just loosely drawing their torsos. These people are walking through grass, so maybe we can't see their feet. And as you can see, I just drew in an indication of the shadows as well. Do a bit of cross-hatching here, just to make sure I know where the darkest areas are going to be. and just a few lines indicating maybe the pathways, and just sort of leads, just a few lines to lead ourselves into that quite large stone. So I think that's it with the initial drawing. And some people ask me, do you mind about the pencil marks showing through in the end painting? Well, no, I don't. I think it actually helps that sort of informal style to this sort of painting. Just have a few pencil marks showing. So here's my 3 colour palette then. So red in the bottom left hand corner there, red is the Rose Opera, yellow top left is Yellow Light, and blue is the Cineris Blue. So what I'm doing first of all is the sky, and with the side of a mop brush, I'm using a Raphael mop brush here, synthetic mop brush, the side of the brush. Started in a sort of random fashion, just dragging it across the sky area. So plenty of mixing going on. Let's get some darker shadows in, using the side of the mop brush. It doesn't matter if I'm going over the stones there. Added a little bit of the blue for the sky. Then a bit of painting around that large stone that's sideways on. Slightly weaker wash when we come down to the horizon. And on the right hand side I left the roof unpainted as well of that farmyard building. Now let's go for a green here, of course, yellow and blue. Trying to get a fairly weak wash for this distant side there. Doesn't matter if the sky just bleeds a little bit down into it. As I say, I've got a slight slope on this, so gravity is taking down just a tiny bit of that sky that's still moist down into the grass here. Now I want to get a bit more intense with this grass colour as I come towards the foreground. In between the two stones. Then warm it up a little bit with a bit of red. As I say, we've got to get more intense with the colour as we come towards the foreground. So I'm making this wash thicker in consistency. It's quite handy having these stones splitting up the painting because I can handle things in different chunks. And also I've left some of the grass unpainted. That would hopefully give a slightly fresher feel to it. So a bit of careful painting around now this first goat. A bit more care than I normally might do. And this brush, although it's quite large, it's got a very good point to it and a good edge, so it does help me doing detail work there, going around intricate shapes like these goats, then around that second one. Along the back, bit of a dip where the neck is. Back over to the left hand side before it dries out. Got to work quite quickly. And getting a bit more careful again. So I'm actually painting over where their legs might be. I'll be using, or plan to use, some white gouache to go over those legs. Far easier than painting around them, which would be, with this sort of size of painting, let's add a really small brush and lots of time. Be quite difficult to do. Paint over those figures, doesn't matter, as long as I can still see the pencil marks, I know where they are. So as I'm coming down, I'm introducing different color blends to this grass is a big area, so we can't have it all being one tone of green. And going back to my reference photo, there's many shades of green in there, a bit of yellow, bit of red with the earth showing through. So that's what I'm trying to do as I come down. And a bit of mixing colours on the paper itself, not bothering with the palette, putting the paint straight from the palette on the paper, adding a next colour, blending it on the paper, making sure that you've got a big mop brush fully loaded with water that helps you do that. So coming down to this lower third now, and I need to make sure there's plenty of paint on my brush. And going back up into, I think you can see that the grass is still moist, so I can still go back up into it with a thicker consistency. Can't go in with a thinner consistency, that would have the detrimental effect and cause ballooning and all sorts of problems. So a thicker mix. So with a lighter wash here, almost clear water on my brush. As the wash is still moist, I can be going in with the same brush, just pure water, and that makes these interesting lines. Now, as well as dragging my brush with clear water across the page, I can do a bit of splattering here. This is a synthetic brush, clear water, and as regards timing, you can't do this generally you can't do this immediately after you lay down the wash. You need to wait maybe a couple of minutes or so and then just splatter it, flick the synthetic brush with clear water onto it, and what I'm doing here is going back with this medium brush. It's loaded with paint. It's just going to help me introduce different textures into this big green area. And generally after splattering, I would let it dry naturally, not speed things up too much with a hairdryer, because the water's still, it's quite interesting. It just keeps moving as it's moist, and if it's on an angle, it's going to again come downwards. So just let it do its own thing. And let's go in with a bit more splattering. Have a bit of fun here. You can see that as the wash was dry, you're going to get, again down to timing, you're going to get more defined balloons and cauliflowers appearing. Next, the background. And we'll start over on the left-hand side. Some background trees. And the same brush again. This is the Raphael mop brush, size 6. So that first stone is cutting the background, splitting up the background, helping us join the foreground with the sky. Continue on. So getting a slightly thicker mix now. for this big tree, and the side of the mop brush. Having slightly rough paper, this does help us when we've got the mop brush on a side like this, or any sort of brush on the side. Just going to help us have a more realistic painting of a tree. Leaves out some little gaps as well. Careful painting around that middle stone to preserve the areas I'd left unpainted before. It's slightly darker now for the base of the tree. And then try and get a little bit darker towards the base, the left hand side of this building now, which again will be quite dark. So I've mixed a sort of brownish shade there. And then with a finger just merging with a sort of smudging action, merging in the those trees and the base of the building with the pasture land. So while that tree is still moist, we've got a slight angle on the board, add in some water, let it come down. With a bit of practice, it gives a slightly more interesting effect to a tree. And like the splattering, just leave it be. Don't be tempted to speed things up with a hairdryer. So stones, big stones, and what I want to try and give a feeling of here is their weathered effect. There's lots of different colours in these stones. Greys, whites, yellows with a lichen growing over them. So this one in the background, fairly light in tone. Use the finger to smudge things along a bit. And then the middle one, a big one, really want to try and put a bit more effort into this one. Up to the pinnacle at the top. I can leave out some little specks here and there because they could be an indication of lighter coloured lichen. bit more intense on the left hand side. I will go in later on with some more darks on the left hand side of these boulders. This is just the first wash, trying to get different colours in there, give a feeling of the weathered look. Then careful painting along the base where it meets the grass up to this first goat. Now this stone that's sideways on, same colour. And the roof of this building, slightly lighter colour to the rest of it, so just had to add put my brush down on the first part. The roof is too dark, went back to my water bucket, add a bit more water, weaken it down a bit, adding a bit more water into this boulder. So I'm just letting it dry just a little bit before doing a little bit more splattering. First of all, this edge of that boulder that's catching a little bit of light. That's another bit of contrast there. The light edge of that boulder up against the background, the darker tree behind. Bit of splattering with a medium synthetic brush. I'm just tapping it against my finger, which is a way of having a bit more control over where the splattering occurs. And then just going in with the medium synthetic brush again, here and there. Like we did before, just let it dry. Don't rush it too much. Just let things dry out a bit more. Now going back to this main boulder, that paint is still damp, so I can still do something with it. And I'm just now lifting out some of the colour. Similar to the splattering, I'm just trying to introduce some different textural feel to it. Let's make sure that edge there, so I've lifted out a bit of that tree that was blending into the boulder. I just lifted that out. Try to get a nice right hand edge as well where the boulder butts up against the tree. And speed up things with a hairdryer. And you can see there with the tree, with the water that dropped into it, gives quite a nice feeling to it. Make sure everything is 100% dry before the next stage. And you can see as it's dried, the darks have become a little bit lighter. Now some shadows on the boulders. That background one, not too dark. And then this closer one, of course a bit darker. Now the shadow going across the grass, I want a dark green here. And because it's quite rough grass, it's not going to be a fairly well-behaved line. And then just in the middle where some grass comes up, bit of shadow behind that. Now this is quite dark, this last boulder. Which helps connect with the background as well. Almost similar tone. Smudge up that edge just to blend it in a bit. Just here and there where there's some protrusions on the boulders, a bit of shadow behind them. Just a little bit, not too much. Go with that background again, it was a little bit too light. Use the finger when necessary. Dry finger, of course. And I've got that dark colour. Dark green colour with the side of the mop brush, drag it across, as you can see, because I've got a textured surface. Gives quite a pleasing effect. Make the left hand of that building a good bit darker, and just under the eaves of the roof a bit of shadow. And the base of the building, and a sort of a wall to the left of the building. Right, down to a smaller synthetic brush now. And these animals, the shadow of that, goat, or a little bit of shadow behind it, and then its belly. The second one and the third one, just a bit of shade underneath their bodies. I'll probably go back to those goats. Right, the figures, starting off with their faces. And then the body. So leave out the very bottom of them because they're walking through some long grass here. And then the second figure. Try and give the impression of slightly different clothing on this second one. And don't forget the arms. And then a bit of shadow for these figures, not too much. Just emphasize that face a bit more. So a bit of shadow underneath the goats. And while I've still got that colour, go back to that boulder again. And where I've got little highlights, add a bit of shadow behind them. They could be little boulders, they could be large flowers with a bit of shadow behind them. Now I've gone in with a bit of neutral tint there just to make sure this shadow under that boulder is really dark. So I'm just going around the complete painting with the same brush. Connecting shapes, adding a few dots, patches. Bit of dry brush strokes as well. Now these goats need a bit more attention with their legs. So I'm going to use some white gouache here. Just mixing in the tube, making sure I've got the right consistency. Not too thin, not too thick. And not showing all their legs. Bit of lost and found. So with this thick paint I can actually cut across those shadows. That far goat walking over to the right hand side. Bit of highlight on the figures as well, not too much, heads and shoulders. Maybe just a little bit on the ears, nose, not too much. And while I've got this white gouache, maybe I can pick up some distant goats. Bit of a tail on that goat. And when I've got the white gouache, a few specks on the boulder, could be lichen, could be protrusions that are catching the light. So I think we're nearly there with this. Final touches was using the white gouache as a bit of highlighter. Just trying to add a bit more blue, almost body colour this, straight blue on that second figure. So that's the painting done. What I'll do now is, well, I've taken a photograph of it, cropped it, just do a quick debrief of what we've done here. So slightly more close up here. As I said, trying to think about the composition and the placement of those stones. Within reason, you can move those stones around to suit the composition. Who's going to tell whether one is slightly out of a line or alignment with the others? Doesn't matter. And then thinking about the placement of the figures on the right hand side, there's sort of almost perhaps the feeling of they're walking either towards you or slightly over to the left. The goats are meeting them as well. And using different watercolour techniques, the sky, bit of wet in wet going on there. And then the main area of the painting, that big grassy area, I introduced as I came down, started with a weak wash towards the background, getting a little bit stronger towards the foreground, introducing different colours. And then with timing, when the paint is still dampish, so you've let it dry maybe 2 or 3 minutes, you can do a bit of splattering, dragging a brush in one line to make a pathway with clear water. And we used some dry brush strokes where we had some of the paper showing through, little tiny dots here and there. I made use of those by perhaps making them into shadows or flower heads or something. A bit of a shadow behind them. And then with the animals, because don't actually paint a lot of animals, I had to spend a bit of time making sure, well, of course, making sure the initial drawing was right, but then spending a bit of time carefully painting around those figures, getting the shadows right, using a bit of white gouache for their legs, and then those figures with slightly thicker paint. You can see that first figure, the shirt is still the green of the background, so perhaps if you look at it, first of all, you don't think of it as the background, but that's what it was. I think we can probably get away with that, just leave it as it is. Nice, couple of nice loose figures there, and then the white gouache for highlights of the heads and shoulders. So there we are, figures and animals in the landscape. I hope you liked that. Please see more of my work on my website, timwilmot.com. Please contact me if you're interested in any workshops or demos. If you're running an art society, be happy to come along and do a demo. But thanks very much for watching, and look forward to catching up with you on my next video. Thank you very much.